This is somewhat linked to my last video about communism, but it's more of a specific issue, and it's basically about censorship. Of all the things that I could think of that I take issue with regarding the Chinese Communist Party, and believe me, there are many, perhaps the single thing that I find hardest to tolerate is the fundamental unfairness of a system whereby only one view is permitted. Now, I've been involved in a lot of debates about this, so that's the base that I'm coming from. I'm not just saying this as someone who's never had some experience. I have been involved in lots of debates. I've been to the country I'm talking about, so I've had some context to work on. Not saying a massive amount, but some context. And certainly I've spent literally years looking into this stuff and studying this stuff, formulating views on this stuff. So there's a context and there's a basis. It's well known that the People's Republic of China, under the Communist Party, has some of the heaviest internet censorship around. Now, just one thing about that. Every country actually has some level of internet censorship. I mean, here in the UK we probably have some censorship, for example, on child pornography websites and on Islamist websites, which do pose a legitimate threat. And that isn't paranoia. There has been Islamist attacks. So there is some level of censorship in every country. And I don't actually believe that the internet should be 100% free knowledge. I think that there is dangerous material out there, and susceptible young people can be taken in by that. And dangerous websites can brainwash people just as much as a political party can. So that's something we need to bear in mind. So it's not a case that I think the internet should be 100% free knowledge. But what I cannot tolerate is the fact that the Chinese Communist Party will edit and censor any material that is critical of them in any way. I've already mentioned how I personally tried to type in contentious terms like Tiananmen Square crackdown, i.e. this. You could see the poster there. You try typing that into China, into Baidu or another Chinese website, and you'll get no results come up. Now, I know a lot of people retort, well, there's 500 million internet users in China and they're involved in rigorous debate. It's true that the situation is better than it was, and it's true that there is a lot of Chinese net users. But that doesn't mean that the Great Firewall isn't in effect. Yes, there's debate goes on, but that debate is very much within a spectrum that is controlled by the CCP. In other words, they will allow a certain amount of debate. And they will allow people, for example, to complain about things like corruption. But they stop short of people talking about controversial events, controversial figures, and so on. And again, this comes down to the fundamental Chinese fear of instability. Now, in a country as big as China, that is an understandable fear. But I still think it is fundamentally unfair. It is unfair that one political ideology can have an opinion, but no one else can. And by no one else, I'm talking about dissidents. I'm talking about, well, there is no political opposition in China because they're simply dismissed as traitors and arrested and probably tortured. So in China, the unfairness is absolutely profound. It's like the Communist Party can come out with all their propaganda, sometimes hateful propaganda. You just need to look at the typical Xinhua rant. It's tinged with outright racism, xenophobia, and bile towards anyone that doesn't endorse the CCP, and that's the way China is. Only those views are really permitted. Like I say, people can make complaints about relatively minor things that are well known, and even the President Xi Jinping has acknowledged as a problem, things like corruption. So they know that they can't crack down on people complaining about those sort of things. because so many Chinese people are angry about it, and they know they would look hypocritical. So what they do instead is crack down on discussion of specific events and specific people. Like I said in the video about objectivity, I do understand that in a country as big as China, the central government, whoever that is, whichever political party that is, does need to ascertain a certain level of authority. I do understand that. I get it. And I do understand there's a legitimate fear of instability. But I still think nothing can excuse the fact that one political ideology can have their view, and yet everyone else is shut up. Dissidents are vilified by the Communist Party. That's why so many Chinese people, frankly, buy into their propaganda. It's not because they're stupid, it's because when you have a system whereby the propaganda is that intense, anyone can fall for it, really, if you're constantly subjected to that. So, for example, a CNN crew, I think it was CNN, it might have been another network, done some interviews in mainland China to gauge opinion on the Hong Kong protests. And the views were frankly rather predictable. It was, oh, it's all an American conspiracy. The USA are always doing evil things, said a middle-aged man. In other words, glorious China can do no wrong. And they couldn't comprehend that actually there's many people in Hong Kong that are deeply uneasy about the Chinese Communist Party. Now, you could argue there is a conspiracy, and the CIA is a very powerful organisation, and so on, but that doesn't change the fact there is legitimate concerns in Hong Kong. And I think it's rather patronising to say that the protesters are just brainwashed sort of sheep that are pawns of the CIA. In fact, in many cases they've been critical of the West being too soft on China. So that is a distortion. But you know, there's things I've noticed. I have noticed when I've been in debates with Chinese people, they're very quick to forgive Communist Party crimes, and yet they are very vocal about things outside countries may have done, such as the Opium Wars. So there's definitely an inconsistency there. And to me that just demonstrates the power of the party's propaganda, because what they can do is portray their crimes against humanity, which is frankly what it was. I'm talking about a lot of the 20th century's abominations in communist rule. Those crimes against humanity are dismissed as mistakes, errors of judgment, miscalculations. So they're trivialized. And that's why there isn't the sort of mass anger in China as there are in a lot of other countries that are led by authoritarian regimes. Also, because the propaganda in China is so powerful. Now, I want to make it clear, this isn't a case that people slavishly believe everything they hear. They don't. A lot of the people I've debated with have conceded, yeah, probably it is propaganda. They know that. They're not stupid. Nevertheless, I do think a lot of their thinking is that, oh, the imperialist West is criticizing China again. And there is this sort of mentality that China is somehow above criticism. I find that rather arrogant. Why should China be above criticism? Why? It's a powerful country. I don't believe any country should be above criticism. I don't believe the United States should be above criticism. I don't believe my country should be above criticism. But there is a sort of tendency among a lot of Chinese net users to get very defensive and sort of react like, oh, how dare you criticize China? What do you know about China? And so on. I would say, well, what do you really know about China? How much of the truth do you actually know? Just because you're Chinese doesn't mean that you have the full truth, because the Communist Party hides it from you as much as they do from anyone. In fact, more so. So, you know, that's... I mean, there's plenty of people about British people don't know everything about this country. So the idea that just because you're Chinese, you're going to know more than a non-Chinese who's actually studied these things is a little bit arrogant. And at this point, I should say, I don't want to come across as arrogant either. I don't know everything. I'm simply voicing my views on what I do know. And I've seen no evidence whatsoever to counter those views. It is indisputable that the CCP uses heavy censorship. Now, there is CCTV 9, which is an English language channel. It's relatively moderate by Chinese standards. It's still clearly got a pro-CCP bias. They do have discussion and dialogue and debate, but I've noticed it's done in a very controlled sort of way, and it's very rare that they would have heated dispute in the way that Western networks would have. And for example, their coverage of the Hong Kong protests has been entirely one-sided. They've interviewed people critical of the protests. I haven't seen them interview a single protester. Now, you can criticise the BBC and CNN and so on, but hand on heart, I have seen those networks interview the other side. They have shown the other side. I'm not just saying that because I'm a Westerner. This is the God-honest truth. It's what I've seen. Years ago, when the torch protests were going on with the Olympics, the BBC came under heavy criticism from Chinese students for its supposed bias. So what did the BBC do? They invited student leaders onto their show, overseas Chinese students, to have their view. Now, can you ever see Xinhua doing that? No. And that is a fundamental difference between the West and China. China is not an open society. It's not. I'm sorry, but that is simply a fact. China is not a country that tolerates other opinions. I know this from personal experience. Why? Because when I was over there, I had to be very careful what I said. I'm not saying I couldn't say anything. I'm not saying I couldn't raise some of these subjects privately. But I still had to be extremely careful. And certainly, if I would have said something on a Chinese website, I would have been in serious trouble. I would have lost my job, possibly been deported. On the other hand, Chinese overseas students in the UK can say what they want about the BBC or about the United Kingdom or anything else. And I don't begrudge them that, because it's part of our values, but I do think that it indicates that we are a fairer society insofar as freedom of expression is concerned. Now, the reason I'm saying this is not sort of pompous, self-righteous, or we're better than China. That is not the purpose of why I'm saying this. Why I'm saying it is because if China really wants to be a progressive country in the 21st century, then it has to really consider these things. The world's looking to China. China's the world's second biggest economy, and pretty soon it may well overtake the United States. So it's very, very legitimate that outsiders ask questions about this rising superpower. And one of those fundamental questions is about freedom of opinion. I remember I had a very long, slightly tense debate with a friend of mine in Shanghai. She was showing me around, and we got talking about a lot of these matters, and it was a healthy debate. It was respectful. Obviously I was grateful that she was being my guide, and I was trying to be respectful to her, but she still sort of she was a member of the CCP, and I only actually found out when I met up with her that day, and so it was a very interesting discourse that we had. I am pleased that we had it, because we shared ideas, and I tried hard to listen to her and be objective and try and understand her viewpoint. And that is why in the last video I was talking about issues that I need to take on board, like the size of China, the stability factor, all that sort of thing. But no one can convince me that the massive, massive level of bias, insofar as the fact that one party controls all media, no one can convince me that that is anything other than unfair. It's so unfair. Now, you can say that the Western media is biased and it's flawed, and certainly I can think of many ways to criticise the BBC, but at least people in the West can freely criticise the BBC. The BBC has a complaint service. Does Xinhua have a complaint service? No, because it is a communist mouthpiece. I hate Xinhua, actually, because I don't think it is good for China, and I don't think it's good for the international community. In fact, I think it's a racist network, because it's constantly stirring up hatred against foreigners. Ironically, some of the biggest criticism of the BBC comes from British people, because they say it's too politically correct, it is too trying to please people. And, some Chinese people might be surprised by that, but actually there are certain Americans, believe it or not, think the BBC is a communist organisation, which I find very ironic, that young Chinese communists get angry with the BBC, and yet Americans think the BBC is a commie network, because there is a lot of left-wing academics involved in it. I'll leave it there, but for me that is one of China's fundamental biggest problems. And to be fair, people I've debated with have acknowledged this. But this is something I can never tolerate. The fact that one party can have such control over all media and just force their views. I think it's an abomination.